Hello. In this section, we'll be talking about the Ottoman Empire. And you can see, if you look at the Ottoman Empire, as we talked about earlier, it's going to expand and eventually destroy the Byzantine Empire and will be a major threat to Europe, right? There, you may have heard of Transylvania, Dracula and all those things. Well, that's a place that had to deal with the Ottomans. You can see a battle in Kosovo here. And these are oftentimes victories for the Ottomans. How powerful were the Ottomans? They got all the way to Vienna in Austria. Now, they were defeated there in 1683, but the key thing we want to stress here, if we want to understand how powerful Islamic empires were and how far behind Europe was, we can see that in the fact that the Ottoman Empire was expanding into the heartland of Western Europe. And one thing, if you think about Western civilization, one thing you think about is Greece. They conquered Greece. So the Ottoman Empire is extraordinarily powerful. Now, I do want to note, they kind of start here and expand west. Keep in mind the city of Constantinople, that was because I'm going to refer to it later, remember that was the capital of Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Christian empire that the Ottoman Muslims will be expanding against. So what led to the rise of the Ottoman Empire? First of all, there was the conversion of Turkish people to Islam, and they will eventually come to understand themselves as following Sunni Islam. So one thing that's important to note, these ethnically speaking, these people are not Arabic. There's sometimes a kind of assumption that if you're talking about Muslims, you're talking about Arabs, but the Ottomans were not Arabs. They were Turks. That's a different ethnic group, and they have their own language. And they, large numbers of them, though, will eventually convert to Islam. And they will begin to raid into the Byzantine Empire, right? When you raid someone, you take your troops and you go into like a village or a city, you kill some people, you take some stuff, and you leave. And over time, what happened was the Ottomans realized that the Byzantine Empire was not very powerful, and there was no need for them to leave. They could just take over the village or the town or the city and just keep it. And thus, they go from being like tribal people who go about raiding to actually forming a government, a state that is increasingly taking control of territory. And when they come in and take over the city or the town, they didn't just capture the town, they captured the people into it. And a lot of these people had useful skills. For example, you need administrators, people who could run the government. You need tax collectors, people who collect taxes. And, it doesn't just make sense to come in and just kill those people. Why not just have them collect taxes for you? And that's what the Ottomans did, right? They come into a town, they say, okay, now this town is a part of our growing empire. And you guys can keep your jobs, but you're working for us now, right? You don't send your taxes to Constantinople anymore. You send them to our Ottoman Empire. Now, this creates, though, kind of an issue because remember, the vast majority of people in the Byzantine Empire were Christians. There was also an important Jewish presence. So the Ottomans, who are Muslims, are conquering these Christians and Jews. And they had to figure out, what do we do with them? And they had an answer because in Islam, Christians and Jews are allowed to keep their religion and become protected peoples if they pay a tax, right? And they are considered what are called people of the book, meaning they're people that were believed to have been given an earlier revelation from God, and therefore, if they're willing to pay a tax, they can keep their religion and do not have to convert to Islam. So this was a fairly easy way to deal with this. Now, I don't want you to think then that Christians and Jews were equal to Muslims. They weren't. They faced a lot of, they were oppressed in many ways. They were kind of second-class citizens, but they could keep their religion, and you couldn't hurt them simply because they were Christian or Jewish. You couldn't say to them, hey, you have to convert to Islam or die. And so this worked really well for the Ottomans because they were able to bring in these people who had useful skills into their empire to serve that empire. In addition, of course, they could use those taxes Christians and Jews were paying to expand their army and conquer even more. Now, you may recall when we talked about China, we talked about this problem of loyalty, right? And the problem of finding good officials, right? Chinese emperor can't be everywhere. He needs officials to help him. So, but officials may say, hey, this is our opportunity to be corrupt. We may try and use our positions to advance the interests of our family, right, or our class, rather than doing what's good for the emperor and the empire. And so you want to prevent that. And the way that the Chinese did that was by having those exams. Now, the Ottomans are going to do things a little bit differently, right? But just to stress, people tend to be more loyal to their families than the state. That's kind of a problem, right? A government official may decide to use the power given to them by the government to advance their family. They may say, okay, I'm going to hire my family members. I'm going to be corrupt and skim some money off the taxes I'm collecting, or add fees or something else to get money from the populace I'm governing, and then give it to my family. And the Ottomans, just like the Chinese, had to deal with this. But they dealt with it differently. They dealt with it through this thing called janissaries. Now, what are janissaries? Janissaries are soldiers and administrators, so people who fought for the empire or helped govern it, recruited from Christian children who were then forced to convert to Islam. Right? And this image here is a kind of drawing of what this might have looked like, right? You have the Ottoman officials coming in and choosing children, and there's the children's being taken, being taken from their family. And they have to convert to Islam, and they don't get to see their families again. Now, one thing I should point out, you may say to yourself, well, I thought if you paid a tax, you could keep your religion. And it's like, yes, that's Orthodox Islam. That's just typically how Muslims have done it. But here, the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, in order to deal with this problem of loyalty, are breaking the rules, right? They're choosing not to follow traditional Islam for reasons of state, right? For reasons of the government. They want to find loyal soldiers. Now, you may say to yourself also, well, why would this make you loyal, right? Why would I be loyal to someone who forced me to leave my family and give up my religion? And my response would be, well, you don't have any choice, right? You have no one to depend on except the Sultan, right? The Ottoman Emperor, right? You've been taken from your family, so you can't depend on them. You've been forced to convert away from your religion, so you can't depend on people from your former religion, in this case, typically Orthodox Christianity, to help you. If you want to have the best life you can, you better make the Sultan happy, because he's the only one who has the power to help you, right? So that's the idea. People tend to be more loyal to their family than the state, so if you cut them off from the family, they're going to have no choice but to be loyal to you alone. So that's the idea. And the fact is, for a long time, this worked really well. The janissaries formed an extremely loyal core of administrators and soldiers. They were very good at conquering and defeating the Byzantine Empire. So, like I said, this is where I wanted to show this is complex. It's hard to just say Islam is this or that. You have the Ottoman Empire generally following the rules of Islam, but then in the interest of state, breaking those rules. So now you have this very powerful Ottoman Empire with a very strong military, and we have a Ottoman Sultan, emperor, named Mehmet, and he will take on the name Conqueror. So there's this question, okay, what are you going to do with this power, right? What is Mehmet going to do that's going to get him the name the Conqueror? He's going to attack Constantinople, which is now known as Istanbul. Now, this is the capital city of the Byzantine Empire. It was basically almost all that was left of the Byzantine Empire because they kept getting beaten up by the Ottomans. But this capital city had stood for about 1,000 years. It had this amazing system of walls that made it almost impregnable. Because of it's an isthmus, it's very hard to actually attack it. If you want to bring in land forces, you have to go like here. If they try to bring in naval forces, they would block this off with a massive chain. It was really hard to get at. But it would finally fall to Mehmet the Conqueror, right? This guy's going to eventually be able to conquer and take over the city of Constantinople. How does he do it? How does he destroy these walls that have stood for 1,000 years? With cannon. With gigantic cannon. Walls are pretty good against even catapults or ballista or things like that. But gunpowder is able to create so much force and throw a projectile with so much force that it can knock the walls down. And that's exactly what the Ottomans did. Right? They're going to knock these walls down. And this will lead to the fall of Constantinople and the destruction of the Byzantine Empire. Now, to the Christians, this is, of course, absolutely terrible. right? The city of Constantinople was the one of the greatest Christian cities in the world. It had the largest church in it, the Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Holy Wisdom. And now it's been taken over by the forces of Islam, by the Ottoman Empire. And it's important to also note that it was a very strategic area. Once you seized it, it would be a great base for expanding further into Europe, and we saw that on an earlier slide. So from the Christian perspective, this is terrible. From the perspective of Muslims, of course, there's this idea, we are awesome, and our religion must be true, because how else could we do this? How else could we take down this city that had stood for 1,000 years? Clearly, God favors us. And you can kind of see this confidence and what this meant for people at the time. If you look at this image, so this is the Church of the Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Holy Wisdom, the largest enclosed structure at the time, the largest Christian church at the time. And this is a place where there had once been an altar where communion had been offered. But Muslims took down the altar and they put this object here, which marks where Mecca is, marks where the Kaaba in Mecca is located, so that Muslims could come here to pray into this church, which has become a mosque, and they would know which way to pray towards, right? Muslims pray facing Mecca. So, you think about this, you're a Muslim who's coming into this sacred place to pray, this church that's become a mosque, and you think, yep, we are pretty awesome. We are pretty awesome. And again, from the Christian perspective, this is pretty terrible. By the way, just as a quick aside, the Hagia Sophia today is a museum. I've been inside it. It's an amazing structure, but it's technically a museum today. But here's the other thing that Muslims who go here think, wow, the Ottoman Sultan, the Ottoman Emperor, is really awesome. He's so awesome, I bet he's the successor to Muhammad. Remember, for Sunni Muslims, what is required for someone to become caliph is to be recognized by the Muslim community as caliph. You may say, how do you get recognition? Well, conquering a Christian city that stood for 1,000 years and converting its beautiful church into a mosque, that's a pretty convincing argument to support someone claiming to be caliph. So at this point, the Ottomans will declare that their sultan is caliph and that they have restored the Ottoman Empire. But there's a problem here, and it's similar to the problem that the Chinese had with the astronomy. Those cannons that I said were so key to allowing the Ottomans to conquer Constantinople, today it's named Istanbul, the capital of Turkey, the cannons were made by a Hungarian, by a European. Right? He had actually initially gone to Christian sources, but he asked for so much money they couldn't pay it, or they didn't want to pay it, so instead he went to the Ottomans. But he built the cannon for them. So that's a problem, because it's the Europeans who are undertaking the technological development. The Ottomans are just hiring them to do it. Now, that's not going to be a problem for a while. The Ottomans, as we saw from the previous map, are going to continue expanding. For now, like I said, this allows further expansion and increased domination of trade, right? This is great for the Ottomans, not a problem. But later, because they're not going to be the people who are going to be developing the advanced cannon and other such forms of technology, they're going to begin to fall behind.